soldiers in the trenches of the First World War aimed their rifles, then cannons, into the sky in sometimes successful attempts to stop enemy planes from completing a reconnaissance or a bombing mission. In the closing days of that war, military leaders began to accept the theory that supremacy on the land cannot be won without supremacy in the air, and that the fight for air superiority included much more than just aerial duels between fighter planes. Rising out of the forbidding sands of Saudi Arabia, the most advanced weapon of its kind prepares for war. It is January 1991, and soldiers of Alpha Battery await another air attack from across the Iraqi border. Their reason for concern lifts off shortly after 9:20 p.m. Saddam Hussein's long-range calling card, the 7-ton Scud. Although its accuracy is questionable, it still carries a 2,000-pound explosive warhead set to detonate upon impact.
Get along, get along, get along. Draw mask and gloves and take cover.
The men and women of Alpha Battery are in combat for the first time. Their only weapon of defense, the Patriot missile, also in combat for the first time. 6 minutes separate the Scud from launch and explosion. It may or may not contain a warhead of chemical or biological agents. No one is taking any chances.
Get along, get along.
When the actual alarm went off that a Scud was launched, it would still take us 30 seconds to find out what direction it was launched at. And by the azimuth that was coming over the radio, we would know whether it was going to Israel, whether it was going to Riyadh, or whether it was going to Dhahran. The soldiers had enough confidence in the system that once they had it prepared for combat, that they were willing to sit there with that equipment and watch the system do its thing.
In one night, the Iraqis launch a volley of Scuds at the Saudi Arabian cities of Riyadh and Dhahran. Within seconds, the engagements are over. 9 of the missiles are intercepted and destroyed.
It's like trying to hit a bullet with a bullet. And the bullet of the Scud coming down and the Patriot going up is probably twice the closing velocity you'd get if you fired two 30-06 bullets at one another. And we're talking about speeds that fast. The Scud missile is not a very precise military weapon. To be frank, they had a hard time in putting a missile on an airfield or on a port. But as a weapon that strikes terror into the heart of the civilian population, it's a perfect weapon for their use. The technology in it is not that great. It looks like what I would call water heater technology. It's about the circumference of a large garbage can. It was not a precise weapon. I had only been in command a couple weeks when this thing took place. But I knew we had well-motivated soldiers. I had confidence in the Patriot equipment, although none of the soldiers had ever been involved in any kind of tactical ballistic missile firing before. I thought we would do well over there. And that was more than borne out by the success that our soldiers and our equipment gained for us in Saudi Arabia.
That was the first of many tonight, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully he just lost another Scud sight or two.
I've been in the Army for 7 years. I went through 6 years of practice and finally got to go play the game. Not that I want to play any more games, but you always wonder, and there's always that uncertainty. How will you react? What will you do? How will your soldiers respond? I feel very comfortable and very proud with the results that we provided. Hope that we never have to do it again, but should we have to do it again, I know we'll be as prepared as we were this time.
The Allied Operation Desert Storm has been characterized as the first truly electronic war. In terms of air defense, computerized airborne radar and ground-based missiles combined to form an electromagnetic shield over the battlefield, thus ensuring that air superiority went to the victor of the airwaves as well as the sky. the warriors of air defense have come a long way since the First World War. The European armies that marched off to battle in 1914 expected to fight for what had always been the richest prize of any battle, enemy territory. Newly conquered land that once occupied left no doubt as to the outcome of the war. But this was to be a war like no other. The aeroplane was coming into its own as a viable instrument of death. From thousands of feet in the air, these flying machines brought terror by way of bombs, hand grenades, and steel darts that killed their victims instantly. For the first time, victory on land depended on who controlled the air above it.
Anti-aircraft started out originally with directed rifle fire, then very soon guns specifically designed for anti-aircraft work were introduced in the First World War. They didn't have the communications linkages to make sure that they could get a fighter in the air to oppose an enemy aircraft intruding. And also there was some sense of discipline that it didn't look good for the troops to scatter when an airplane came, so that they ordered them to stand and turn and fire. In practical fact, the troops soon learned that they'd better scatter because their chances of hitting the airplanes were small and the chances of getting hit by the airplane was relatively large.
One of the earliest tactics in air defense called for balloons with heavy metal cables to be strung around high-priority targets for protection.
Barrage balloons were really put up to force enemy bombers to fly higher, to bomb their targets from a greater height. Therefore, they would not be quite so accurate. And also to stop low-level attack. Obviously, fighters will come in very low machine gun targets. If there are barrage balloons there, that will deter them, because if an aircraft flew into a barrage balloon, it will probably take a wing off and crash.
Ironically, the first anti-aircraft guns were designed to shoot down balloons before airplanes became such a menace. The French took the lead in defensive firepower with their 75mm autocannon. Often mounted on trucks, the early guns had little difficulty hitting the slow-moving German Zeppelin balloons. It was the airplane that proved a real challenge. With seconds to react to an air attack, the quest for early warning systems began. Again, the French took the lead by capitalizing on the airplane's most obvious weakness, its noisy power plant.
Acoustic sound locators were basically a series or a set of horns that were connected to an operator by earphones that enabled the operator then to, as he was scanning the horizon, pick up the sound of a target or an incoming plane. Once he had established the general area where this plane was coming from, he could relay that information to a searchlight crew that could illuminate the area so the gun batteries could begin opening fire. A very primitive and certainly an unscientific method of detecting a plane at night, but this time this was considered the state of the art, and this is the only thing that was available to them.
The First World War also exposed basic problems for the gunners, problems that exist today. How to hit a target that is moving in 3 dimensions when its future flight path is uncertain. One had to guess how far the target would travel relative to the time the explosive shell was in flight, so they would meet at the same time. In the early days, these calculations were done by charts and tables. Still, the system could only be considered a marginal success. It took French artillerymen an average of 3,000 shells to knock down one German airplane over Paris. The years following the war were marked by improvements in aircraft speed and manufacturing. Biplane wings gave way to monoplane designs, and all-metal fuselages carried faster powertrains to speeds over 250 miles per hour, fast enough to outpace the improved acoustical sensors devised to follow them. While the offense was gaining momentum, the most significant achievement in air defense history was dawning in England. In 1935, Dr. Robert Watson Watt demonstrated that a bomber would reflect the radio waves given off by a BBC transmitter. Within 4 months, a radar set had been built that could detect aircraft 17 miles away. The basic elements of radar have changed little since they were discovered in the 30s. A radio transmitter generating radio waves from an antenna illuminate an area of airspace. A target, such as an airplane, that enters this space bounces a small portion of the radio energy back to a receiving antenna. When this weak signal is amplified and displayed on a cathode ray tube, it can be tracked by an operator who can follow its every movement. The uneasy armistice of 1918 and the weapon limitations in the Treaty of Versailles were intended to re-establish peace throughout the world, but they only served to postpone a Second World War. Following the seizure of power by Hitler and the Nazi Party in 1933, Germany's underground rearmament program came from undercover, revealing to the world the Luftwaffe's new aircraft and a well-equipped mechanized army. With his invasion of Poland in 1939, Hitler was on the march, and the British watched the European nations fall victim to the Nazis' revolutionary brand, a lightning war. Of all the European capitals, London was the easiest to find from the air. Winston Churchill once described the city as a tremendous fat cow tied up to attract the birds of prey. The British looked to radar as their only hope of early warning should they be next.
They made a commitment to it. They immediately began installing the chain home series of stations, which were the big antennaed stations around the perimeter of England at the time of the Second World War. And they came into being just enough time to give them a little practice and permit them to use against the Germans. It was just the nearest run thing you've ever seen.
In June 1940, the German army appeared invincible. Their blitzkrieg combination of armor and air power had defeated France in just 6 weeks. A plan for the invasion of England, codenamed Sea Lion, was submitted to Hitler in early July 1940. The British had not been invaded since the year 1066. For the operation to succeed, the plan called for the destruction of the Royal Air Force. The Luftwaffe was tasked to take it out one plane at a time, to clear the path for a land invasion within 60 days. Air Marshal Hermann Goering estimated it would take 4 days to gain air superiority. On the morning of July 10th, British anti-aircraft command radar picked up an unusually large mass of planes heading across the English Channel. The first phase of Sea Lion had begun. The citizens of London were alerted to take shelter. Radar operators quickly pointed RAF fighters to the Luftwaffe's position.
The British, even with the meager resources they had in comparison to the Luftwaffe, were able to maintain this edge by knowing where the enemy was and where they were coming from, and also when they weren't coming, so they could get their planes down, refueled, rearmed, and back in the air. This was a big advantage that the Germans never really realized that the British had.
While the German pilots had more combat experience, their Stuka dive bombers and Messerschmitt fighters lacked the fuel capacity for extended aerial engagements. A dogfight lasting more than 15 minutes often meant they wouldn't make it back to France. Those German planes that made it to England were subject to a barrage of 3-inch guns. The Germans never fully appreciated the effect early warning radar had on their operations until it was too late. Within 3 months, their Air Force lost 1,733 aircraft, and Hitler postponed his invasion indefinitely. In 1941, America installed its first radar stations on the Hawaiian Islands to help protect the Pacific Fleet.
None of the people in the company had actually seen one of these units until that time. Then most of the training was actually done on the job. The radar equipment, while primitive, was very good equipment, and we felt that we were on the leading edge of technology. We were a relatively new company, but it was a rather relaxed lifestyle for the most part. I know the tensions were building up between Japan and the United States. We know also that there was a war going on in Europe, but the war in Europe from the Hawaiian Islands was half a world away.
On Sunday, December 7th, the Japanese attack force was 220 miles north of Oahu. At 6:10 a.m., the first wave of 183 aircraft were launched. In Hawaii, Sunday was a day of rest. At Opana Point Radar Station on Oahu's north shore, the normal Sunday hours were 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. On December 7th, Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott were on duty. They decided to keep the station open later so Elliott could practice on the new equipment.
Shortly after 7, we got this indication of what seemed to be a very large flight. In fact, it was the largest display I'd ever seen on the scope. Well, I thought at first there was something wrong with the equipment, so we ran through a series of checks and decided that the equipment was functioning properly, and we followed it for a while and decided that maybe we better tell somebody about it.
First time in history, American radar had detected enemy planes. Lockhart and Elliott reported their sighting to the Fort Schaffner Information Center twice, but on Sunday, only an inexperienced officer was on duty. He told them not to worry about it.
He felt that it may have been a flight of B-17s that were coming in from the West Coast that were due that morning. But this was coming directly out of the north, which seemed to be a strange way to come from the western coast of the United States.
At 7:15, the planes were only 92 miles from the radar station. At the same time, the Japanese launched a second attack wave, 168 more aircraft.
We had no idea that it was an enemy attack, none. You got to put yourself in the time frame to understand. Nobody on the island was expecting an attack.
At 7:39, the radar lost the sighting in the hills and the equipment was shut down. At 7:55, America suffered the worst naval defeat in its history. Congressional hearings absolved the radar crews of any dereliction of duty. Radar had proved its value, but like any system, it's prone to human error. The close cooperation between radar sites and fighter control centers in the Battle of Britain cast the mold for all air defense systems that followed.
Once radar was first employed on a large scale by the British, obviously the radar war then started. How you could stop that radar becoming effective. And that throughout the 1939 and 45, there was a constant battle between the British and the Germans.
Still smarting from their defeat by the RAF, the Germans began assembling their own radar air defense system. Fighters and anti-aircraft guns were on constant alert for Allied bombers. The primary German air defense gun was the 88 millimeter. It could fire a 20-pound shell as high as 26,000 feet.
They were difficult to obtain victories with because the chances of hitting an airplane were remote, but they would put up enormous flak barrages so that the aircraft would simply have to fly through them, and might run into a shell. Later, there was radar-directed flak, which was much more effective.
By 1944, more than 10,000 of these guns were in operation. For the Allied bombers to get past them, they had to devise ways to defeat the German radar. One such tactic was the use of chaff.
Well, chaff originally was tinfoil cut into strips that happened to match the frequencies of the radar emitters being transmitted against it. Chaff would be dropped and it would simply blank out the German screens. The first time it was used was on the raid on Hamburg in 1943, and the German radar operators simply didn't understand what was happening because they could no longer see the British or their own night fighters on it. It simply blocked out everything as if they'd drawn a shade down.
The whole radar screen would be a mess. They couldn't see our aircraft coming. But they soon changed frequencies. They got better radars. We had different types of foil. So all the way through the war, there was a constant battle. You could call it the battle of the scientists, where they were each trying to outwit the other one.
Perhaps the most important anti-aircraft development of the war was the proximity fuse. Originally a British design, it was tested and produced in the United States. The top of each shell contained a tiny radio transmitter and receiver that sensed the presence of an aircraft while in flight. The gunners on the ground no longer needed a direct hit on their flying targets to score a kill.
This was really a small radar built into the nose to the fuse area of the projectile, and it exploded when it got in the proximity of a target. The mechanical fuse went off at the end of a certain time, whether they hit anything or not. But if you can get in the vicinity of the target, well, you can get hits.
At first, the proximity fuses were so secret, they were used only over water to prevent duds from falling into enemy hands. But the Germans were developing a weapon that forced the Allies to reconsider their policy. The V-1 buzz bomb was Hitler's weapon of last resort. As the first jet-powered missile, it could carry a 2-ton warhead about 160 miles, just far enough to reach England from France. After the Allies invaded France in June of 1944, Hitler unleashed over 5,000 V-1s over Britain in an 80-day period. The V-1s traveled quickly for their day, crossing the English Channel at speeds up to 400 miles per hour. Compared to airplanes, they were 8 times harder to hit. At 2,300 feet, they were too high for light guns to reach and too low for the bigger guns to follow. But the British gunners were ready. They moved all their anti-aircraft artillery to the coast and armed them with proximity fuses. When the Nazi attacks ended, the proximity fuse had engaged 79% of the V-1 rockets. The fuses would go on to become standard equipment on guided missiles from then on. With the advent of the atomic bomb and the jet engine, post-war air defense efforts changed drastically. The Soviets were designing bombers capable of reaching the United States and were developing atomic weapons of their own. To counter this threat, the U.S. Air Force developed the Bomark missile, which was essentially a pilotless, remote-controlled vehicle that carried an atomic warhead. Although the Bomark weighed over 15,000 pounds, it had a slant range of over 440 miles. Its mission was to fly into a squadron of Soviet bombers. Once its proximity fuse sensed the bombers, its nuclear bomb would detonate, obliterating anything within range.
You could attack flights of 4 or even single aircraft, and if they were maneuvering and high speed, you had a better chance of getting a kill with the larger radius of destruction that even the smallest nuclear weapon would put up there.
Post-war anti-aircraft gun development was principally concerned with increasing muzzle velocity to keep up with the faster jet aircraft and reduce the shell's time in flight. The American .50 caliber machine gun was improved to fire 2,000 rounds a minute with a range of over 1,500 yards. The latest gun was the 75mm Sky Sweeper.
The Sky Sweeper was the first air defense system that had the radar integral to the mount, and it was the first attempt to get true mobility. Before that time, the guns were separate from the radar, and the radar were separate trailers, and the computer was a separate trailer. The packaging for the Sky Sweeper put this all on one mount.
But just as the problem of conventional guns was being solved, guided missiles began showing promise. The first operational U.S. surface-to-air missile was the Nike Ajax.
It was deployed on a grand scale. They manufactured perhaps, I think, almost 20,000 of them. There were sites all around the country. They were an effective system that fed into what was called the SAGE system as far as the ground control, and they would have been quite effective against incoming bombers.
The Nike could travel close to 4 times the speed of sound with a slant range of 87 miles. In addition to the Nike, a smaller, more mobile missile emerged that could be transported in theater along with the Army. The Hawk battery consisted of 2 acquisition radars. In the battery-controlled central van, the tactical control officer monitored the incoming threat's speed and direction. The Hawk's illuminator radar would search the sky. Once locked on, it automatically tracked the target. After the missile was launched, it relied on the illuminator's radar signal to steer it to the target. In 1972, the Hawk's manufacturer, Raytheon Corporation, modified the missile's guidance system with solid-state electronics and increased its warhead size to accommodate 100 pounds of explosives. The improved Hawk now flies at 2.5 times the speed of sound. Over 20 countries currently have the Hawk in operation. Although the 1,300-pound missile is somewhat bulky by 1990 standards, the U.S. Department of Defense is confident enough in its performance to keep it operational until the turn of the century.
This is the Red Eye. It is a man-transportable, shoulder-fired air defense missile.
A third family of missiles developed in the 50s was the man-portable missile. When it was first introduced in 1964, the Red Eye was the first surface-to-air missile designed to be used by hand.
It has a speed of 1.2 Mach, or 1.2 the speed of sound, weighs 29 pounds, and is used by frontline soldiers. It is a disposable weapon system. In other words, once you fire it, it's already prepackaged from the factory. You just throw the weapon away. It's also a fire and forget weapon system, in that it is a heat seeker. Once it's locked on a target and the missile itself leaves the launch tube, then the gunner can throw the tube down and he can run, and he better run fast because it's going to be following a jet aircraft, and the vapor trail could give away his position.
While battlefield air defense weaponry progressed, the advent of intercontinental nuclear ballistic missiles made whole continents potential battlegrounds. To answer the Soviet nuclear threat, an early warning system had to be assembled in Canada, over which Soviet bombers and missiles were expected to pass if launched against the United States. The largest radar systems in the world became part of the North American air defense system.
It provided to the United States and to Canada about 2 to 3 hours warning of an inbound bomber penetration so that interceptors could be scrambled. They decided to move to a place where they would be protected from incoming ballistic missiles by going to a hardened site. So they went to Cheyenne Mountain near Colorado Springs, Colorado, and simply excavated an enormous quantity of material from the earth to create within the mountain a complex that became NORAD headquarters, and which was the command and control center for the defense of North America. It had particular import with the ballistic missile because the times were cut down so much. With the bomber penetration, you had 2 to 3 hours. With an incoming ballistic missile over the North Pole, you had perhaps 30 minutes.
In the late 50s, American coastal defense depended on Navy picket ships and Texas towers positioned out in the ocean to give notice of all inbound aircraft. These systems proved effective, but their range was limited by the curvature of the Earth. To satisfy NORAD commanders, the EC-121 was produced. As one of the first airborne warning and control systems, its radar scopes could scan 360 degrees without any interference to determine an enemy plane's position and altitude.
That was used primarily to direct fighters in to counter Russian aircraft which could have attacked America. But when the Vietnam War was on, it was used as a very primitive type of airborne command post.
The EC-121 crews arrived in Southeast Asia in 1965, initially to maintain a radar watch over North Vietnam. But they adapted quickly to the combat environment and soon began issuing intercept vectors to fighter aircraft. They also plotted the positions of downed airmen and warned of surface-to-air missile launches that appeared on their radar. In 1968, the EC-121s began carrying senior air staff commanders who took advantage of the 7 tons of surveillance equipment and coordinated airstrikes directly from the plane. On the ground in Vietnam, a new air defense weapon appeared in 1968, the Vulcan anti-aircraft system. The Vulcan's terrifying rate of fire protected armed convoys against Viet Cong ambushes and guarded against low-flying aircraft.
It was a Gatling gun concept, 20 millimeter, but I think the high rate of fire, even if aircraft were not shot down, I understand that the pilots were very close to having heart attacks when they would see the number of tracers, especially at night, coming up at them.
Its radar system works oppositely of most. First, the gunner acquires the flying target visually, then he turns on the radar to calculate the range to the aircraft. In 1969, the U.S. Army took delivery of the Chaparral, a low-altitude air defense system developed to protect troops in the forward edge of the battle area. The Chaparral's mount carries 4 modified Sidewinder missiles that track themselves to the target with infrared heat-seeking sensors. The missiles are the same as those used on jet fighters with modifications to give them a greater range.
The early versions had only a tail chase capability, seeking the hot gases from the jet aircraft, but with future developments, they are able to get a capability for incoming aircraft. Once the seeker locks on, it flies its own course and follows the aircraft.
In 1972, research began on a shoulder-mounted surface-to-air missile that could replace the red eye. U.S. Army directives called for a system that could interrogate its target by radio to determine if it was friendly or not before firing. The weapon that emerged is the Stinger missile.
The gunner initially tracks the target manually, and the seeker is bore-sighted with the range ring, so it sees what the gunner is seeing. And once he acquires a tone, he uncages the weapon system, and that allows the seeker to track it independently. It's also equipped with an IFF subsystem, which stands for Identify Friend or Foe. It aids the gunner in identifying friendly aircraft. It sends out a signal to a transponder in an aircraft. If that transponder is coded with the same codes that we have, then it will give back a positive friend. So it aids the gunner in early engagement.
Few handheld weapons have been considered to have won a war, but the use of the Stinger in Afghanistan is widely regarded as a primary reason the Soviets withdrew from that country. After the success of the EC-121 airborne radar plane in Vietnam, a newer version was designed to take its place and provide the ultimate eye in the sky. The E-3 Airborne Warning and Control System, or AWACS, represents the world standard for early warning systems. Built by Boeing Aerospace and Electronics, the E-3 fills the needs of both airborne surveillance and command communications for tactical and air defense forces. Its radar eye can see more than 200 miles in any direction. On board are two senior officers, the aircraft commander on the flight deck and the mission commander in the back.
The advantage of an E-3 aircraft is really it is a mobile command and control aircraft which can be deployed as near as the front line as possible. Therefore, it can look deep into enemy territory.
At the heart of the AWACS is an IBM multiprocessing computer that can separate airborne targets from ground and water clutter that confuses most other radars.
If it's looking into, for example, Iraq, it could see the Iraqis scrambling MiGs, and then, therefore, the AWACS will be able to direct our aircraft into the best tactical position. Also, it is not vulnerable. Radars on the ground can be knocked out. AWACS are moving around the sky. It could still be attacked by enemy fighters, perhaps, but it is not so vulnerable as fixed radars on the ground.
The AWACS is built on a commercial Boeing 707 airframe. Its range is 5,000 miles, and its top speed is around 500 miles per hour. The E-3 can stay aloft for more than 11 hours without refueling, in spite of its protruding rotodome on top.
The only difference it causes is a little bit slower airspeed overall. As far as aerodynamics, it has no effect whatsoever on the flight of the aircraft. It causes no problems during takeoff, landings, or air refueling. So it's designed to give us neutral lift, and that's exactly what it does.
Since it began service in 1977, over 30 AWACS have been delivered to the U.S. Air Force. Other models have been sold to the United Kingdom, France, and Saudi Arabia. Perhaps the most popular air defense weapon today is the Patriot missile, a long-range, high-speed, and highly maneuverable guided weapon system that was originally intended to replace the Nike and Hawk batteries.
The Patriot missile was originally developed some 20 years ago, primarily as an air defense system to engage aircraft. It's only in recent years it's been developed to engage ballistic missiles. And basically, it's got a radar van, fire control van, and a number of missiles. The radar is constantly sweeping through an arc. It will pick up a missile coming in and will automatically work out the best time to fire a missile to engage the target before its impact.
Here at Alpha 61, our launcher control panel, you see we have 8 launchers readily available at any given time. Each launcher can contain up to 4 missiles on top of it, for a total missile count of 32. At the present time, we have 26 missiles ready for launch.
The system can track more than 50 targets, interrogating each of them and assigning priorities to those identified as hostile. The launchers are factory sealed and are opened only when the missile is fired. Propelled by a single-stage solid fuel rocket, the Patriot flies in excess of 3 times the speed of sound. Its guidance system adjusts its 4 tail fins to steer it within lethal range of its target. The missile can be fitted with conventional or nuclear explosives. It is totally transportable and can be set up in less than 1 hour. Today, the requirement for reliable air defense weaponry is greater than ever before, as the threats facing moving armies can now come from a variety of fixed aircraft, helicopters, or cruise missiles. The proliferation of mobile missiles continues on an international scale. The British manufacturer Short Brothers Javelin takes on all current attack aircraft and helicopters.
The first line of defence for an army would be the shoulder launch systems. In the case of the British Army, it is now the Javelin. and that is a shoulder-launched missile which is pointed at the target. When it comes within range, it is launched and the operator guides it onto the target.
A variant of the Javelin is the British Starburst, which was deployed to the Gulf War. Starburst is said to be immune to all known countermeasures. It can be brought rapidly to action over the shoulder, or like Javelin, can be mounted on a 3-round multiple launcher. Another anti-aircraft weapon is British Aerospace's Rapier. Day or night, it can still accurately fire its missiles in a concentrated electronic countermeasures environment.
Most armies employ a number of highly mobile systems. A typical one of these is Roland. Roland was developed by the French and German armies. Typically, it is mounted on a tracked chassis and has 2 missiles in the ready-to-launch position. The targets can be tracked optically or with radar. Once a target is located, it is first tracked by a surveillance radar. Then when it comes in nearer, it hands over to the tracking radar, and then when the target is within range, a missile is launched and impacts the target.
The most recent addition to the U.S. Army Air Defense Arsenal is the Boeing Avenger. It's the only American system that can track and shoot airborne targets on the run, making it ideal for convoy escort. Its missiles are the same as those used on the Stinger handheld weapon. The Avenger can be operated up to 50 yards away by remote control, allowing the crew to bunker down if necessary to reduce their exposure to an adversary. The remote unit can lock on to a heat source and fire each of the 8 missiles by push-button command. The Avenger represents the latest trend in air defense weaponry systems that can do more with less to survive on tomorrow's battleground.
Since the First World War, air defence has been one of the key elements of every country. It's got to have an adequate air defence force. In the future, it will become more automated. More countries will have AWACS-type aircraft, and more countries will have Patriot-type systems. As they perform so well in Operation Desert Storm, I think more countries will invest their defence dollars into procuring air defence systems of the AWACS type, as well as better command and control systems. As your force structure goes down, you've really got to make the maximum possible use of your forces. They're what we call a force multiplier. It enables you to make the maximum possible use of your given resources, which are now becoming very scarce.
The boundaries of today's battleground stretch far beyond the contested territory and the adjacent airspace. They extend into the invisible world of the electronic spectrum. Victory in tomorrow's war will come to the champion of the electromagnetic battlefield.